Hello, folks. Welcome to the first lecture in American Literature 1, or the pre-1865 American Literature Survey with me, Dr. Jess Goldberg. What I'm going to do for these lectures is they're always going to be between 10 and 20 minutes, and I'm always going to pull up a PowerPoint slide presentation and walk through it with you and kind of talk over some of the notes. And as I talk, I'm going to probably be asking some questions. Some lectures, I might just have one or two questions at the very end. In this particular lecture, I'm going to have a question at the beginning and a question at the end. And what you're going to do is you're going to listen to this lecture, you're going to watch this video, and when a question comes up, you're going to pause the video, respond to the question, and then keep going. So with all of that, let me get started on our first video lecture in American Lit 1. And this is Conquest, Storytelling, and Early American Literature. So, I'm going to start with some, there we go, now you've got it. Going to start with some meta commentary. And so this is a vocab word for you guys. Meta commentary means when you are commenting or talking about something um, on a level that is one level kind of like higher than the literal content. So as if you're getting a bird's eye view. So meta commentary in popular media would be something like if you were watching a zombie movie and in the zombie movie, a character in the movie said a line about how, you know how in zombie movies people always make the silly mistake of doing X. If a character in a zombie movie makes a comment about the genre of zombie movies, that's meta commentary. And so that's what that word means. You might have heard a word, those of you who are psychology majors, or if you took a first year seminar, metacognition, thinking about thinking, right? So meta is that prefix that means like you're doing something about the thing itself. So some meta commentary to begin our lecture on what is this course that you're in? This is an American Literature Survey course. And so I explained in our first class session, or I usually do, that a survey course, broadly speaking, is a type of literature course, and it could be organized in many different ways, but it's a type of literature course that is meant to be a wide look at a particular type of literature that is wide and not very deep. And so a survey could be organized by genre. So you could have a science fiction survey where you read many different works of science fiction without going deep into a particular subgenre like feminist sci-fi or Afrofuturism or indigenous sci-fi, right? More particular, the general sci-fi survey would mean that you'd hit on many different examples of science fiction that represent different subgenres or different kinds, right? Um, uh, these are also often organized by national tradition. So the two most common kinds of survey classes in English departments in the United States are, well, there's three. There's really three most common. There's American literature, British literature, and world literature. For reasons that are beyond the scope of this 2000 level English class, those have been the three major categories of literature in US and also in Canadian universities in English departments. So, for example, here at Highlands, there is American Literature 1 and American Literature 2. There's also British Literature 1 and British Literature 2. And fingers crossed, if one day we're able to hire a world literature expert, we could do World Literature 1 and World Literature 2. Um, and so when a survey course is designed around a quote unquote national tradition like American or British literature, the job is to have a survey or a wide look at many different examples of American literature. And so what this does is it gives you a sense of literary history. And so what that means is giving you a historical sense of how literary traditions develop over time. And so in our course, we're going to go in chronological order from roughly the like 16th and 17th century and earlier, and then we're going to move forward chronologically through time up until 1865, which is the end of the American Civil War, which is fairly universally used as the dividing line between American Lit 1 and American Lit 2 in the vast majority of universities in the United States. So, part of our course is you're going to learn the history of history, meaning the history of how history gets told. Over time, what American literary history was changed as different writers became more prominent or less prominent in how they were received and how they were talked about. And that will come out as the semester goes along. So a key point here is that the structure of the survey course undermines itself, and that's a good thing. What I mean by that is because a survey is a wide and not a deep look, and because a survey can only encompass so much because it's limited by being a 16-week lower level class where I can't assign you big long texts. So like, for example, you're not going to read any of the quote unquote great American novels of the 19th century because they're too long. Right? But also there's so much literature, you can't possibly get the full picture of American lit before the Civil War. It is impossible for me to give you the full picture. You're only going to get the widest like possible glances. And in that, by the end of the semester, no matter how good of a job I do as a professor making the syllabus, there's going to be gaps. There's going to be things that we don't read. There's going to be demographics of writers that we just don't touch on. There's going to be topics that we miss. There's going to be literary movements that we miss. And so we always do our best job as professors to give you the best look possible, but the structure of a survey, given the limits of time and just how wide of a coverage we have to get to, we will always miss things. And actually, that's great because it allows us to see that built into the course is the very notion that there's no such thing as a perfect picture of American literature. That American literature is always a pursuit rather than an arrival. And that's a beautiful thing. And so one of the things that comes to the front, one of the ways in which that comes to the front right away is the problem of starting points. So I have a question for you. Why do we start our course with Native American oral traditions? And I want you to literally pause the lecture right now and go write a comment that's at least 3 sentences long that responds to that question. So pause the video, respond to that question, and then resume. Okay, welcome back now that you've responded to that question. A couple things about early American literature. And I put America in scare quotes here because America is a contested terrain, both as an idea and as a place, right? And what I mean by that is the very idea of what America is, what counts as America, who counts as American, has always been and continues to be contested terrain, meaning different groups literally argue and fight, sometimes quite literally, over what counts as America and what counts as American. And this has profound effects on the development of so-called American society. This is both of something that happens on the terrain of ideas, who's a real American, right? A question that I know resonates with you. But it's also a question of literal place. Um, we are currently doing this class at New Mexico Highlands University in the state of New Mexico, a state that has historically gone through being the place of various indigenous people, where various indigenous nations have claimed territory, to being claimed as a Spanish colony, a colony of Spain, to being part of the nation of Mexico, to then through an American imperialist war in 1848 becoming part of the United States of America. And so the idea of where America is, what land is America, is itself contested, right? And so this changes over time through sometimes literal battles. And so we start, one of the ways of thinking about American literature and starting with indigenous oral traditions is because indigenous oral traditions predate, that is, they come before the very idea of America itself. They come before this land that we call North America was called North America, right? And so when we're doing an American literature course, one of the things that we do as instructors, especially now in the 21st century, is we start by very simply and bluntly stating that before there was an America, there were rich oral literary traditions of various nations on these lands. And so what happens at the moment that we start thinking of America is we get a conflict between indigenous worldviews and European worldviews as European conquistadors and settlers arrive on what is called North America. And this conflict of worldviews is is materially played out in the violence of conquest, right? So there's the kind of worldviews and battle of ideas where, as we discuss in class when we discuss the indigenous oral traditions, certain ideas about, especially the relationship between the human and the non-human world, and the hierarchy or non-hierarchy or reciprocity between the human world and the non-human world is contrasted with European Christian worldviews of the great chain of being and the hierarchy of beings, right? That is a conflict of worldviews that results in dramatically different ways of organizing society. But that's not just a conflict of ideas, it's a conflict that plays out in the literal, material, bodily violence of conquest, where European settlers literally set out to through the violence of attempted genocide, wipe out indigenous peoples to claim land as a new nation, right? Um, and so in a literature class where we're talking about American literature, literature is a form of storytelling. And the legacy of storytelling in a national literary tradition birthed by the violence of conquest and colonization means there is a constant conflict on both levels, the level of idea and the level of place, over who has the right to make meaning in place, right? Who claims place and who claims the meaning of place, right? The very idea of even calling something American literature is already something that has conflict baked into it. And so from the very outset, we understand that American literature is not a given. It's not a perfectly formed picture that exists in a way that can be taken up in any given university's American literature class, because it is something that we have conflict over, right? That is itself developed through conflict. Um, because again, just from these first readings in our class, we read both Native American oral traditions, which express certain kinds of worldviews that are completely out of sync with the dominant Christian worldviews of the European conquerors. But then we're also going to read the first person accounts of some European settlers that shows that there's no such thing as a homogenous idea amongst the Europeans either. Just like different indigenous nations had different ideas and different worldviews. Different Europeans, like De Vaca and Columbus, have different conflicting worldviews themselves, right? And so we don't have homogeny, we have heterogeneity. Homogeny meaning uniformity and kind of everything being the same, heterogeneity meaning difference and diversity, right? And so there's difference and diversity both amongst indigenous peoples and amongst Europeans, even as we, in very broad strokes, talk about the difference between indigenous worldviews and European worldviews, right? So again, this is kind of like broad brushstrokes. I'm not getting into the details because this is the first couple weeks of the class, but just setting up the kinds of contrasts and layers that we're going to be digging into in this class. On the last point on this slide, differing literary and cultural forms as well as content, I want to flag right at the beginning of the class that not only are we talking about differences in the content of the text that we're talking about, so obviously there's going to be obvious difference in that someone like Bradford or Columbus is going to be talking about Christian religious worldviews, while the religious worldviews of the indigenous oral traditions that we were discussing will have principles of the relationship between human and non-human animals that are different from Christian ideas of the relationship between human and animals, right? So there's difference at the level of content, but there's also difference at the level of form. How ideas are expressed in a literature class is as important as what the ideas are. And that's so important for you to know that I'm going to say it twice. How ideas are expressed is just as important as what the ideas are, right? And that is so important to a literature class. Okay, so I'm going to just really quickly address this question that we're going to come back to for the next 14 weeks of the semester. Why do we have to talk so much about religion, race, gender, sexuality, and other things that aren't polite, casual conversation? And so you might have noticed that immediately, right off the bat, in our discussion about indigenous oral traditions in the first weeks of the semester, in our class conversations, Christianity and the Bible come up, and it's like, why do we have to talk about Christianity and the Bible? Why do we have to talk about religion? And then as we go forward, you'll notice that a lot of the writers in our class that we read are talking about religion. You'll notice that it is impossible to talk about some of the writers that we read without talking about race, gender, and sexuality. Um, we're going to study Frederick Douglass and William Apis at some point in the semester, African American and Native American speakers and writers who are talking about racial injustice. Very soon, we're going to talk about Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley, and it's impossible to talk about Bradstreet and Wheatley without discussing gender and the role that gender plays in how their poetry is received, as much as we have to talk about how just genuinely beautiful their poetry is, we also have to talk about gender and race when we talk about them. We're going to be talking about Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. Dickinson and Whitman are the two most iconic poets of 19th century America, and they're both queer. And so it's impossible to not mention that the two most iconic poets of 19th century America are both queer writers. And so we have to talk about these things precisely because American literature is this contested terrain. And for as long as there's been something called America, there has been arguments over who counts as American and which writers get to count as true American literature. And that leads me to more meta commentary on the American literary canon that has to do with the epigraph that's on the first page of your syllabus. At the top of that syllabus, I have a quick point from Toni Morrison that says, canon building is empire building. Canon defense is national defense. And so what the very basic idea in that quote is that comes from an essay where Toni Morrison is talking about what's called the American literary canon. And the canon is basically the kind of agreed upon, in quotation marks, list of writers and texts that make up what we mean when we say American literature. What are the representative texts? Who are the representative writers of American literature? And what Morrison is talking about here is that when we're building a canon, when we're talking about who gets to count as part of the representatives of American literature, we are building a defense of a nation, right? We're defending who counts as America. So when English professors fight over does a writer count as as a part of American literature, part of that fight is about who counts as Americans. And I say that because for a long time in universities, for most of the 20th century, syllabi for American literature classes had basically all white male writers, and then Emily Dickinson as a representative of women, and Frederick Douglass as a representative of Black people. God forbid there was a Black woman or any other person of color who wasn't an African American. Um, and so nowadays, you can't teach an American literature class that's built that way. American literature classes now have writers of many different backgrounds. But that was a literal fight amongst scholars to say that no, America isn't just white men, and the writers we teach can't just be white male writers. And I highlight this at the beginning of the class to say that some versions of teaching American literature are basically ways to get students to the point at the end of the semester to say, American literature is a reflection of the diversity of America. In this class, the way that I teach, diversity is the given and not the point. we start in week 1 and week 2 by saying like American literature is diverse, and that's just a fact. That's not like the big, oh my God, wow moment. Wow, yeah, American literature is really diverse. No, 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 it just is. That's just the given. It's not the big mind-shattering or earth-shattering moment of saying like, wow, the syllabus is diverse. Like, nope, that's just how it is. And I want it to be that nonchalant, to just understand as a given. We don't have to fight in this class about the fact that American literature is a racially is a body of literature that is diverse in terms of the race, gender, sexuality, disability, class, positions of all of our writers. Okay, ending slide. A quote from Toni Morrison. To those who talk about how as well as what, who identify the workings as well as the work, for whom the study of Afro-American literature is neither a crash course in neighborliness and tolerance, nor an infant to be carried, instructed, or chastised, or even whipped like a child, but the serious study of art forms that have much work to do, and which are already legitimized by their own cultural sources and predecessors, in or out of the canon, I owe much. And I'm ending the lecture with this quote from Toni Morrison because here Morrison is saying something that is the foundation of how I teach literature classes. I just very impassionedly told you that in this class, the idea that American literature is diverse is a given. We're not going to argue about that. And so when we're reading works by writers who might come from cultural traditions that might be different from your own as a student in the class, that might be different from mine as the professor, we need to read that literature not as sociology. And what I mean by that is when you read a piece of writing by, to use Morrison as an example, a Black woman writer, the point of that is not to tell you something about Black women, period. Instead of just taking in the kind of identity content or the cultural content of literature, what Morrison herself is demanding of us is that we take the work seriously as a work of art, that we do the harder work of approaching and receiving literary works as aesthetic works, as works of art that demand to be talked about in terms of the how and not just the what. How does this poem work? How does this play work? How does this novel work? How does this writer make their point? And here's the key word here, craft. How was this text crafted? That's the harder work of a literature class. It's easy to say, on some level, it is genuinely easy to say that, oh, now that I've read this work by someone who's different from me, I have more empathy for people who are different than me. No, that's not enough in this class. That should be the first layer. What I want you to do, and what Toni Morrison herself, a Black woman who for so long was excluded from the literary canon, despite being one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, what Morrison demands of us is that we not approach, in her own words, literatures of difference as a crash course in neighborliness and tolerance, but instead as art forms that have much work to do. And so I finished this lecture by asking you, I used the phrase doing the harder work. I talked about how Morrison is asking us to talk about how texts are crafted and not just what they say. So as you hear me say that, as you reread, as you pause this video and reread Toni Morrison's quote, as you look back at some of the slides, as you let what I've said kind of marinate over you, as you maybe replay some of the lecture on a slower speed to really take in what I'm saying, as you go back and look at how you answered the first question I asked, as you really think about what's going on at the beginning of this class, the second question that you're going to answer as a response to this video lecture is, what does doing the harder work mean in a literature class? Okay, and that's it for this opening lecture. I promise this will be the longest lecture of the semester. None of the rest will be as long as this one. So thank you very much for sticking with it, and I look forward to reading your responses.